What happens when a legendary British actor sits down for what should be a friendly morning chat, only to face a barrage of personal attacks and condescending remarks that push him to his absolute breaking point? In just 35 seconds of verbal warfare, a respected television host destroyed her own reputation and sent shockwaves through the entire entertainment industry with comments so outrageous that even her own crew could barely believe what they were hearing. This is the story of how Michael Caine, one of cinema's most beloved and respected gentlemen, found himself in an impossible situation on live television, a situation where staying silent would have meant accepting disrespect, but speaking up would mean walking away from an interview that millions were watching. This is about the moment when politeness met its limit, when professionalism collided with dignity, and when one man decided that some things are simply not worth tolerating, no matter how bright the spotlight. The morning started like any other at the studio. Michael Caine was scheduled to appear on the show to discuss his latest memoir, a book filled with decades of Hollywood stories and life lessons from a man who had seen it all. The veteran actor arrived early, as he always did, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his signature glasses perched on his nose. Behind the scenes, crew members were excited. After all, this was Michael Caine, a two-time Academy Award winner, a knight of the realm, and a man whose career had spanned more than 6 decades. Everyone expected a delightful conversation filled with warmth, humor, and perhaps a few amusing anecdotes from his incredible life. Lorraine Kelly greeted him as the cameras prepared to roll. The studio audience was buzzing with anticipation. The lights were adjusted, the microphones checked, and then they were live. The interview began pleasantly enough, with Lorraine asking about the memoir and Michael responding with his characteristic charm and wit. He spoke about his early days in London, his breakthrough roles, and the people who had shaped his career. The audience was captivated, leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word from this cinematic icon. But then, something shifted. Lorraine's tone began to change. It started subtly at first, with a question that seemed innocent on the surface but carried an edge that made Michael pause. She asked, "So Michael, in your book, you talk about your humble beginnings, but looking at you now, sitting here in your expensive suit and your luxury lifestyle, do you ever feel like you've forgotten where you came from? Do you still relate to ordinary people, or have you become too comfortable in your ivory tower?" The studio fell quiet. Michael smiled, but there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He responded calmly, "Well, I think my entire life has been about remembering where I came from. I grew up in a working-class family in South London. My father was a fish market porter. I've never forgotten those roots, and they inform everything I do." Lorraine didn't let it rest. She pressed on, "But surely you must see how that might ring hollow to people struggling to pay their bills while you're living in luxury homes around the world. It's easy to talk about humble beginnings when you're sitting on millions, isn't it?" Michael's smile faded slightly. He shifted in his seat, clearly taken aback by the aggressive line of questioning. "I've worked very hard for everything I have," he said, his voice steady but firmer now. "I started with nothing and built a career through dedication and perseverance. I don't apologize for succeeding, and I certainly don't think success means you've abandoned your principles." But Lorraine wasn't finished. In fact, she was just getting started. What happened next would become one of the most talked about moments in television history. She leaned forward, her expression hardening, and said, "Let's talk about something else then. Your book mentions various relationships over the years. You've been married twice. Some might say that shows a lack of commitment. What would you say to people who think you just moved on when things got difficult?" The audience gasped. This was crossing a line. Michael's personal life, his family, his marriages, these were sacred ground. He had always conducted himself with dignity and privacy when it came to his loved ones. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he said nothing. The silence was deafening. Then, measuring his words carefully, he replied, "I think that's a deeply personal matter, and frankly, quite inappropriate to bring up in this context. My relationships are not fodder for gossip." Lorraine laughed, actually laughed, and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, come on, Michael. You wrote a memoir. You put your life out there. Surely you expected people to ask about the interesting bits, not just the sanitized Hollywood stories you want to tell." Michael's face reddened. His hands, which had been resting calmly on the armrests, now gripped them tightly. "There's a difference between sharing stories about my career and having my personal relationships attacked on live television," he said, his voice rising slightly but still controlled. "I came here to talk about my work, about the craft of acting, about the experiences that might inspire or entertain people. I didn't come here to be ambushed." The word ambushed hung in the air. The camera operators exchanged glances. The producers in the control room were frantically talking into their headsets. This was going off the rails, and everyone knew it. But Lorraine, either oblivious to the situation she was creating or deliberately pushing forward, continued her assault. "Ambushed?" she repeated, her tone dripping with mock surprise. "I'm just asking questions, Michael. If you can't handle a few straightforward questions, maybe you're not as tough as all those hardened characters you've played on screen. Maybe the real Michael Caine is a bit more sensitive than we thought." That was it. That was the moment. Michael Caine, a man known throughout the industry for his professionalism, his kindness, his ability to handle any situation with grace, reached his limit. He stood up, not quickly, not with a dramatic flourish, but slowly, deliberately, with a kind of quiet dignity that spoke volumes. He carefully removed the small microphone clipped to his lapel, placed it gently on the coffee table between them, and looked directly at Lorraine. "I've been in this industry for over 60 years, he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I've been interviewed thousands of times by journalists from all over the world. I've sat through tough questions, challenging conversations, and heated debates. But I have never, in all those years, been treated with such blatant disrespect. This isn't journalism. This isn't even entertainment. This is cruelty disguised as conversation." Lorraine tried to interject. "Michael, I think you're overreacting." He held up his hand. "No, I'm not overreacting. I'm responding appropriately to inappropriate behavior. You've insulted my character, attacked my personal life, and dismissed my achievements. You've done this not to elicit truth or insight, but to create conflict for ratings. I won't be part of it." The studio was absolutely silent. 200 people, including the live audience, the crew, and Lorraine herself, watched as this legendary actor prepared to walk away. Lorraine, perhaps finally realizing the gravity of what she'd done, attempted to backtrack. "Michael, please sit down. Let's start over." "I didn't mean." "You meant every word," Michael interrupted, his voice still controlled but firm. "That's what makes this so disappointing. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. You made a choice to conduct this interview in this manner, and I'm making a choice to end it." He turned toward the exit. But Lorraine, in what can only be described as a spectacular display of poor judgment, made one final comment that sealed her fate. "Running away, Michael? How very brave of you. I suppose the mighty actor can't handle a little heat from a Scottish woman half your size." Michael stopped. He turned back, and for a moment, everyone thought he might respond with anger, but instead, his expression was one of profound sadness and disappointment. "This has nothing to do with handling heat," he said quietly. "This has everything to do with recognizing when a conversation has become toxic and having the self-respect to remove yourself from it. I hope, for your sake, that you reflect on what happened here today. I truly do." And with that, he walked off the set. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every second of his departure. Lorraine sat there, her face a mixture of shock and defiance, seemingly unable to process what had just happened. The audience began to murmur, then whisper, then talk openly among themselves. Some applauded Michael's exit. Others sat in stunned silence. But let's go back and understand how this interview spiraled so completely out of control, because what you saw in those final moments was the culmination of a conversation that had been deteriorating from almost the beginning. After those initial pleasant exchanges about the memoir, Lorraine had begun to inject barbs into her questions. At first, Michael had handled them with his characteristic grace, deflecting with humor or answering thoughtfully despite the hostile framing. When she had questioned his connection to ordinary people, Michael had responded not with anger but with genuine emotion. He talked about his father working in the fish market, about his mother cleaning houses to make ends meet. He spoke about the small apartment they'd lived in, how he'd shared a bedroom with his brother, how they'd sometimes gone to bed hungry. These weren't just stories. These were his memories, his truth. And Lorraine had dismissed them as if they were nothing more than convenient anecdotes. "It's all well and good to reminisce," she had said, cutting him off mid-story. "But reminiscing doesn't change the fact that you're now part of the elite. You attend parties with royalty. You have homes in multiple countries. You're hardly a man of the people anymore, are you?" Michael had taken a deep breath. "Success doesn't erase your past," he'd said. "It doesn't mean you've betrayed your origins. I'm proud of what I've achieved and I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had, but I've never pretended to be something I'm not." That's when Lorraine had pivoted to the attack on his marriages, the moment when the interview crossed from uncomfortable to unacceptable. She had not only questioned his commitment, but had done so in a way that suggested moral failing. 2 marriages, she'd said, emphasizing the number as if it were evidence of some character flaw. Some people might say that indicates a pattern, an inability to make things work. What do you say to that? Michael had visibly recoiled. I say that my personal relationships are exactly that. Personal. I've loved deeply. I've experienced loss. I've built a family that I'm incredibly proud of. To reduce that to a tabloid headline is not only unfair, it's cruel. But Lorraine had continued, undeterred. Your current wife is significantly younger than you. Does that ever feel like you're trying to recapture your youth? Trying to deny the aging process? The audience had audibly gasped at that question. It was so clearly designed to provoke, so obviously meant to insult. Michael's face had flushed. His hands had tightened on the armrests, but he had maintained his composure. My wife is a brilliant, accomplished woman who I love dearly. The suggestion that our relationship is about anything other than genuine connection is offensive to both of us. But you have to admit, Lorraine had pressed, it looks a certain way. Older man, younger woman, it's a story we've seen 1,000 times. The powerful man with the trophy wife. That phrase, trophy wife, had been the penultimate straw. Michael's voice had gone very quiet, very controlled. My wife is not a trophy. She's a human being with her own career, her own achievements, her own life. The fact that you would reduce her to an object, an accessory to my life, says far more about you than it does about us. Lorraine had smirked, actually smirked, as if she'd scored a point. Touched a nerve, have I? You've crossed a line, Michael had replied. There's a difference between probing journalism and personal attacks. What you're doing right now is the latter. And that's when Lorraine had made the comment about his inability to handle questions, the suggestion that he was too sensitive, too fragile to engage in real conversation. She had questioned his toughness, compared him unfavorably to the characters he'd played, and essentially called him weak. For a man who had spent his entire life building a reputation on integrity and strength of character, it was perhaps the most insulting thing she could have said. The interview had started 20 minutes earlier. For the first 5 minutes, everything had been fine. Michael had been funny, engaging, warm. He talked about nearly working with Stanley Kubrick, about his friendship with Sean Connery, about the time he'd nearly turned down one of his most famous roles because he didn't think he was right for it. The audience had been eating it up. Lorraine had seemed genuinely interested, asking follow-up questions that showed she'd actually read the book. But then something had shifted. Maybe she'd received a note from her producers. Maybe she'd decided the interview was too soft, too safe. Whatever the reason, the tone had changed dramatically. The questions had become accusations. The conversation had become a confrontation. And Michael, a man who had handled difficult interviews with grace for 6 decades, had found himself in a position where the only dignified response was to leave. Let's talk about what happened in those crucial moments after Michael removed his microphone but before he made his exit, because this wasn't just about one man walking off a set. This was about a clash of values, a collision between respect and sensationalism, between dignity and the desperate pursuit of viral moments. Michael had stood there, the microphone in his hand, looking at it almost sadly. This little device, he'd said, holding it up, is supposed to amplify voices, to help share stories and ideas. But too often, it's used to amplify cruelty instead. He'd placed it down carefully, precisely, as if even in his anger he couldn't bring himself to be careless with someone else's equipment. Lorraine had shifted in her seat, her confidence beginning to waver. Michael, I'm just doing my job. This is what interviews are now. People want authenticity. They want real conversations, not scripted promotional material. Michael had shaken his head slowly. Authenticity doesn't mean cruelty. Real conversations don't require tearing someone down. You can ask challenging questions without being disrespectful. You can probe difficult topics without being cruel. The fact that you've conflated the two is deeply troubling. So what would you have me do? Lorraine had asked, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. Just lob you softball questions? Let you promote your book without any real substance? I would have you treat me like a human being, Michael had replied simply. Ask me challenging questions about my work, about the industry, about the choices I've made in my career. But don't attack my family. Don't mock my relationships. Don't suggest that my success has made me less than who I was. There's a world of difference between those approaches. The audience had begun to applaud at that, a spontaneous show of support that clearly surprised Lorraine. She'd glanced at them, then back at Michael, and for a brief moment, something like uncertainty had crossed her face. But then her expression had hardened again, and she'd made that final, fatal comment about him running away, about not being able to handle heat from a Scottish woman half his size. The comment had been designed to emasculate, to diminish, to reduce this accomplished, respected man to someone weak and cowardly, and it had backfired spectacularly. Because Michael's response, his quiet statement about recognizing toxic situations and having the self-respect to remove yourself from them, had been so clearly, so obviously right that even Lorraine's most ardent supporters couldn't defend her. As Michael had walked toward the exit, his posture straight, his pace measured, the camera had captured every step. The studio's main camera had followed him, and you could see in his face not anger but disappointment. He'd looked like a man who had expected better and been let down. He'd looked like someone who had given someone a chance to do the right thing and watched them repeatedly choose the wrong path instead. The door had closed behind him with a soft click. Lorraine had sat there in her chair, alone on the set, with the audience staring at her in silence. She tried to smile, tried to regain control. "Well," she'd said, her voice a bit too bright, a bit too forced. "That was certainly unexpected. Michael Caine, everyone, leaving the interview early. We'll take a quick break and be right back." But the damage was done. In the control room, producers were having urgent conversations. On social media, clips were already beginning to circulate. People who had been watching live were typing furiously, sharing their shock and outrage. The interview, which was supposed to promote Michael's memoir and provide entertaining morning television, had instead become a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview. What made this situation particularly striking was the contrast between the two people involved. Michael Caine had spent more than 60 years in the public eye, maintaining an essentially spotless reputation. He was known as a gentleman, someone who treated everyone from directors to catering staff with equal respect. He'd never been involved in scandals. He'd never bad-mouthed colleagues. He'd never used his status to demean or diminish others. His career had been built not just on talent, but on character. Lorraine Kelly, on the other hand, had built her brand on being warm and approachable, the friendly face of morning television. Her show was supposed to be a safe space, a place where guests could relax and have genuine conversations. She'd interviewed everyone from politicians to pop stars, and her success had come from making people feel comfortable. But on this morning, she'd abandoned everything that had made her successful. She'd traded warmth for antagonism, curiosity for cruelty, and connection for conflict. The question everyone would ask later was why? Why had she chosen to conduct the interview this way? Why had she attacked a respected guest who had done nothing to deserve such treatment? Why had she continued to push even when it was clear she was crossing lines? The answers would be speculated about for weeks afterward, but in the moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was what had actually happened, the words that had been said, the respect that had been violated, and the decision that had been made. Michael Caine's walk-off wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a diva moment. It wasn't an overreaction. It was a measured, thoughtful response to a situation that had become untenable. He had given Lorraine multiple opportunities to course correct. He had responded to her provocations with patience and grace. He had tried to steer the conversation back to substantive topics. But when it became clear that she was committed to her approach, when it became obvious that no amount of dignity on his part would elicit respect from her, he had made the only choice available to him. Think about what that took. Michael Caine was in the middle of promoting his book. Walking off this interview meant potential damage to those promotional efforts. It meant negative headlines, at least initially. It meant becoming part of a controversy rather than just being the distinguished actor sharing his stories. But he had decided that some things matter more than publicity. He had decided that self-respect, human dignity, and basic decency were worth more than playing along with a toxic game. In the seconds after he left, while Lorraine was trying to compose herself for the break, you could see crew members on the edges of the frame. Some were shaking their heads. Others were clearly upset. One boom operator had put down his equipment and walked off the set as well, unable to continue working after what he'd witnessed. This wasn't just about Michael Caine anymore. This was about everyone who had watched someone they respected being mistreated and felt complicit by their participation. The stage manager, visible for just a moment, had approached Lorraine during the break and appeared to be having an intense conversation with her. Lorraine's expression had gone from defensive to uncertain to something approaching panic as she realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. Because this wasn't going to blow over. This wasn't going to be forgotten. This was going to be the thing she was remembered for. The moment that defined her career in a way that no amount of previous good work could overcome. Michael Caine, meanwhile, had left the building. According to people who were there, he had walked calmly to his car, declined to comment to anyone trying to ask questions, and driven away. He hadn't slammed doors. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't done anything that could be construed as unprofessional. He had simply removed himself from a situation that had become unacceptable, and he had done so with the same dignity and class that had characterized his entire career. The interview had been scheduled to last 30 minutes. It had ended after 22 minutes. Those 22 minutes, but especially the final 8 minutes of escalating tension and conflict, would become some of the most analyzed moments in television history. Media analysts would dissect every question, every response, every facial expression. Journalism professors would use it as an example of how not to conduct an interview. Public relations experts would point to it as a case study in crisis creation. But on that morning, in that moment, it was simply a man who had had enough. A man who had been patient, who had been gracious, who had tried to maintain civility in the face of provocation, finally reaching his breaking point and choosing dignity over compliance. It was a reminder that respect isn't optional, that kindness matters, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away.